Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask for everyone here in-house if you'll make a courtesy check that your cell phones and other mobile devices have been muted or turned off during our presentation. And of course, for those watching online, at any time you're welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program this afternoon is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. He began his career on Capitol Hill as a policy aide to Senator John McCain, focusing on trade, defense, and foreign policy. He later served as senior professional Republican staff for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, advising on East Asia affairs. He joined the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council, served as the Council's senior country director, representing America in Indonesia and Singapore, before becoming senior vice president and executive director at the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter?
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming out. The last month has been a very bad time in Bangladesh. 5 horrendous murders by what appears to have been Islamist terrorists. The most recent one claimed, in fact, by ISIS. Unfortunately, they are not anomalies, but part of a longer trend, 35 over the last year or so, really going back to 2013, 2014. There have been very similar attacks. The spate of attacks raises many very serious issues. Freedom of speech. One of the recent attacks was on LGBT activists, and several have been on bloggers. Religious liberty issues. There have been attacks on Muslims, Christians, atheists, Hindus. Democratic development in Bangladesh. I think that's a very serious issue at stake here as well, and even the international struggle against Islamist terrorism, given the international connections that some of these attacks seem to have. We've got a very distinguished group here to discuss these issues with us here today, and to explore how Bangladesh may address these issues going forward. The first speaker gives me great pleasure to welcome back to Heritage Manpreet Singh Anand. The last time Manpreet was here was 2007. We were just chatting about this a moment ago for a program we do at Heritage called The View from the Hill, where we bring in Hill staff. At the time, he was working on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. That same panel, we had Evelyn Farkas. I also mentioned to him, so we have a pretty good batting average when it comes to the upward mobility of some of our guests. So we're going to try that same program here again. We've done it about 10, 11, well, since I've been here, and then going back maybe 15 years we've done that program. We'll be doing that again soon, so you can show up and see who the next Deputy Assistant Secretaries are going to be in the coming administrations. Manpreet was appointed last year to his current post, that is as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs. Immediately before this, he oversaw regional affairs at the Bureau. Manpreet joined State Department from USAID, where he served as Deputy Assistant Administrator. In addition to working at HVAC on the professional staff, he's worked at Chevron Corporation and at USTR. So with that, let me turn it over to Deputy Assistant Secretary and get us started.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, thank you, Walter, for hosting today's event and for all the great work that you direct here at Heritage Asian Studies Center. I'd like to also thank Lisa Curtis for inviting me to give remarks today about a very important topic that is at the forefront of everyone's mind. How Bangladesh can prevent violent extremism from taking root, and how its partnership with the United States can help in that effort. I know that a panel of experts will be speaking with you shortly, so I'll try to keep my comments brief. Though I want to start with talking about how some of the greatest moments of my career, especially during my time at USAID, have come out of opportunities to work with some of the most remarkable individuals in Bangladesh, including in government, and business, from NGOs, civil society, and all of the people on the ground that have helped Bangladesh become one of the world's model development stories. For decades, Bangladesh's story has been about the power of people's hope for a better life. That is what has allowed the country to reduce poverty by a half, cut maternal and child mortality by more than 2/3, go from being a food importer to a food exporter. The country is also a recognized leader in peacekeeping operations, in mitigating the effects of climate change, and in empowering women and girls. And many of Bangladesh's achievements in recent years are simply unprecedented in the world and give us great hope to what the country can accomplish in the future. It is precisely because so many of us want Bangladesh to succeed and care deeply about the partnership between the United States and the 8th most populous country in the world that our conversation today is more solemn. We remain deeply distressed by the recent killing of Julhas Manan, a beloved member of our embassy family. We also mourn Avijit Roy, an American citizen and a courageous proponent of free and rigorous thought and discussion. And of course, there have been too many others touched by the brutality of extremism over the last couple of years, almost all of whom stood strong for individual freedom and the rights of others. The United States is very focused on ensuring the government and the people of Bangladesh know we fully support them as they seek to reverse this disturbing trend and prevent the further spread of violent extremism. And we're working through this at the highest levels of our governments. I can tell you that Secretary Kerry spoke to Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina last week about this very topic. And at this very moment, my boss, Assistant Secretary Nisha Biswal, is on her way to Dhaka to meet with senior leaders in the government and on how to protect Bangladesh's citizens and its interests, as well as our own, from further violence. It is important to put Bangladesh's current struggle into context, however. No society is immune to the menace of violent extremism. Violence which, in the name of religion, attacks ideas with knives, machetes, bullets, and bombs, is no stranger to us here in the United States. Despite our many blessings and our success at integrating and accepting new communities, we too have seen individuals who believe they are justified in meting out their personal violence. And we should also remember that this hateful violence is not monopolized by any one religion, culture, or creed. The people of Bangladesh, the United States, and citizens all across the world have been affected by senseless violence stemming from any number of perverse ideologies, and each of us has a role in preventing it from spreading further. But what's at stake here is ensuring that Bangladesh remains a model of development, a moderate, tolerant country that embraces its diverse citizenry. The United States and Bangladesh share a vision set out at the country's fight for independence to protect its citizens' ability to safely and securely pursue their prosperity and well-being. In Bangladesh, the people themselves are on the front lines of this battle. The role of the government is to temper any reactionary impulses and instead preserve individual liberty, free speech, pluralism, and rule of law, while also diligently pursuing the perpetrators of these acts of violence through legal channels. History has taught Bangladesh and the United States that we must protect ourselves from being beset by fear and acting in ways that are antithetical to the freedom of our citizens. And during such a time of challenge, it is even more important to respect the rule of law, political rights, and the ability for Bangladeshis to speak their mind. History also shows that we must not fail to recognize the real danger and not deny the origins of the menace, nor blame the victims or political opponents. This threat arrives in a context when the political process is already strained. We know that the Bangladeshi people value their democracy and are rightfully proud of it. and they know the value and the strength of a political process that is open and inclusive. The United States believes strongly that freedom of speech should be preserved, that free speech is as important when it criticizes the government as when it voices praise. We don't want people in Bangladesh to have to think twice before they voice their conscience, nor should they have to worry about inviting a backlash from the so-called protectors of religion on one side and the defenders of government on the other. A strong, confident government should ensure protection even and especially for its critics. Free speech is what enables a society to discuss and identify the best way to fight terrorists, to fight poverty, to provide education and health care, and a growing economy. But we know that preserving free speech, holding free and fair elections, and creating space for a vibrant civil society to operate will not alone prevent violent extremism. To defeat terrorists like the ones menacing Bangladesh today will require swift, fair, and effective enforcement of law and order. This means vigilance to prevent attacks, intelligence to detect potential threats, well-trained police to investigate attacks once they happen, and laws, prosecutors, courts, and jails to ensure terrorists receive justice for their crimes. This is not the first time that Bangladesh has faced threats from violent extremists, and as before, the United States is providing assistance to counter the threat. Although crude violence is still the calling card of the terrorists, they have learned to use technology and social media to aid their perverse campaigns. This makes the government's task all the more difficult. But we are again offering assistance, including helping the government understand and deal with the new contours of this threat. And we're supporting a range of programs to prevent and counter violent extremism, programs that use the power of Bangladesh's vibrant communities and energetic civil society, and to offer an attractive alternative to ideologies that espouse hate and savagery. The United States believes that the people of Bangladesh are stronger, braver, and more resilient than the nihilist ideologues who threaten them. Bangladesh has a history of overcoming difficult challenges, and we are hopeful that this spate of tragic violence can soon be contained and overcome. Through our strong partnership and a focus on diligent law enforcement, we know that Bangladesh can overcome this challenge without sacrificing the democratic freedoms that have helped its people become so successful in every field of endeavor. So again, I'd like to thank Heritage for convening this event and help to bring some new ideas to a very difficult issue. We truly appreciate the work that you're doing here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for that, ma'am. Appreciate it. It's an honor to have you here as a representative of the administration. It really shows, I think, that we can work together on a lot of things of mutual concern. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Let me invite the panel up for the next part of the program. All right, well, I look forward to not only talking about the issue more generally and looking at the perspective that our guests here have, but actually thinking of some of the things that Deputy Assistant Secretary had to say, I think would be interesting as well. First off, here we have Dr. Samina Ahmed. Samina is South Asia Project Director and Senior Asia Advisor with the International Crisis Group. Other places she's served include the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where she was a senior research analyst, and the Institute of Regional Studies. Her PhD is from Australian National University. Let me turn it over to you, Doctor, and you can kick us off. I think if folks could stay to maybe 10 or 15 minutes, no more than 15 minutes, and we can get some Q&A and at the end and some good discussion.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, and also a particular pleasure to sit in the same panel as Lisa. It's been a long time since we've, sat and discussed issues of mutual interest and concern, and certainly Bangladesh and the challenges that Bangladesh faces today are a matter of grave concern. A number of you would have seen the report that we've very recently published on the political conflict, extremism, and criminal justice in Bangladesh. Let me just start off by saying, let's put everything in a comparative perspective. I work on the countries of South Asia, not just in Bangladesh, on Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Kashmir. And where Bangladesh stands today, in some ways, is not comparative to the extremist violence in Afghanistan or the extremist violence in Pakistan. This does not mean that what we've seen in the last year, and in fact this year as well, should not be considered a wake-up call. It's absolutely essential that this threat to free speech, to the pluralism of a tolerant society shouldn't be taken seriously. The threat itself requires, quite obviously, more than just words. It requires action, and swift action on the part of the Bangladeshi government. It's problematic when attacks have taken place and efforts have been made to, in some ways, distract attention away from what is an extremist challenge and to point a direction instead of something which is equally important and I think also needs to be addressed, which is a political competition. And that is what we have actually seen even in this latest murder of a USAID employee, when the government's response was to say that this is actually a threat and an attempt to destabilize the government. What was needed instead was a very strong statement against the perpetrators of this attack, followed by, indeed, as the government has said, actions to trace the perpetrators and to take swift course with due process to hold them to account, which takes us to what the focus of our report was on, the absolute importance to have a functioning criminal justice system, as well as the importance of Bangladesh addressing the political challenges and conflict that emanates from those challenges as it moves forward. So what I would like to focus on, all the challenges are identified in our report, is what can be done at this point in time by the Bangladeshi government, A, to counter the extremist threat, and B, to address the political challenge which could possibly lead to, as we've seen prior to the 2014 election and after it, the violence that engulfed the country. So let me start off by saying that there are problems in the way both challenges have been met. And part of the problem lies in the fact that the law enforcement agencies, the rule of law sector, is increasingly weak, the weakest possibly that it has been in many, many years in Bangladesh. And until the rule of law sector is strengthened, combined with a tolerance, as Manpreet said, for criticism, which was a vibrant part of Bangladesh's political culture, after all, a democratic, liberal, and tolerant culture, then neither threat is likely to be met. What we've seen in the past few years is in some ways what appeared to be very much a zero-sum game. Two major political parties, both democratic, but both competing in ways that seemed more and more undemocratic. An election which was deeply contested, a parliament now that doesn't have an opposition, which in any parliamentary democracy poses challenges, because then criticism of the government is often seen as opposition to the government and not constructive. So where there is criticism, it's actually coming from allies, constituents, supporters of the Awami League, not its opponents. Clamping down on that criticism and rejecting it does not help the government address its many challenges, both political and security related. Accepting criticism from the media, accepting criticism from civil society, allowing that debate to happen, is the one way that lessons can be learned. Above all, what's needed at this point in time is political healing. This is not to say that intolerance is only exercised by one side of the political equation. We have seen equally on the part of the political opposition in the pre-2014 election and after, violence in the streets, the hartals and strikes that took place, the economic activity came to an end. But the government's response has been equally heavy-handed, which exacerbates political tensions and encourages retaliation in kind. Is there an opportunity now to end this zero-sum game? And I think this is where we have to look at where the openings are. And one of these openings, I think, is becoming increasingly clear, which is the opposition, which had a one-point agenda, which was new elections. We do not accept the legitimacy of this government. We will not take part in an exercise which is illegitimate, walking back a bit. The BNP's participation in local government elections is the first baby step in re-entering the political fold, the constitutional path. The Awami League government should respond and takes, in fact, with responsibility resting far more on the government, steps to reconcile. That is the way that the state can be stabilized. It will require political compromises on both sides, but it will also require, and we stress this in our report, an end to the repressive use of law enforcement, the politicization of the police, and the misuse of the criminal justice system. And I say that quite strongly because that takes us to the other challenge, which is the security challenge. Unless the criminal justice system is depoliticized, unless the rule of law is not just accepted in the breach, but actually respected, unless there is due process, unless there are free trials, then it just dents, A, the government's legitimacy, and B, marginalizes the very agencies that can help Bangladesh counter what is increasingly a worrying trend, a climate of impunity in which extremist groups are finding that they can fill the void. Second, the BNP, the political opposition, must also respect the constitutional and democratic path. Returning to the violence of the past is not going to be either helpful for the opposition if it intends to form, as in any parliamentary democracy, in an election, the next government. So both sides, the opposition and the government, bear responsibility in ensuring that the democratic process continues uninterrupted, and that spoilers are not given opportunities to exploit the tensions that have, in some ways, created this political stalemate. As far as dealing with violent extremism is concerned, again, let me emphasize, the only way that this will be effective, bypassing the rule of law, bypassing the importance of due process, will only create more opportunities for violent extremists to depict the government and the security agencies, and indeed the democratic process, which they don't accept anyways, but in the eyes of the public, as unacceptable, and that their path is the path to justice. So justice, I think, underlies the most important factor for both political stabilization and for countering violent extremism. What can the United States do? And there, I think, is something that we suggest which might be controversial. But we do suggest it because the leverage that the United States has is a partnership that we heard about. And indeed, that partnership has been a very constructive one. But there are times at which I think it's important to also to have conditionalities. And that conditionality already has been used and constructively used for labor rights, which is the generalized system of preferences being made conditional on Bangladeshi action with regards to the conditions of working class citizens and of the labor movements. And Bangladesh has taken some steps in response to this, using the same conditionalities for improvements in human rights, free speech, association, and free trial. Might appear controversial, but it is in, I think, the interest of the United States to at least put that forward, and for the Bangladeshi government to understand that it is in its own interest. If the mainstream avenues of dissent remain closed, and if due process is absent and the criminal justice system remains dysfunctional, then there is only one gainer, which is an extremist element that is trying very hard to destroy what has been, since this government came into being as well, a democratic process, which is the only way that Bangladesh can prosper and stabilize it. I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I may come back later. I'd like to come back to this issue of the conditionality because I think it's a little bit apples and oranges. That is conditionality on labor and their with GSP and conditionality on political issues through the same instrument. But we can talk about that some. First, I'd like to turn to Dr. Ali Riaz. Dr. Riaz was also here many years ago. In fact, in 2007 also. It's really great to welcome you back as well, so thank you for being here. Dr. Riaz is a university professor and chair of the Department of Politics and Government at Illinois State University. He's been at Illinois State since 2002 in various academic capacities. He's also spent a significant amount of time as a journalist and teaching journalism at several different colleges, which makes his contributions to today's discussion particularly helpful. Dr. Riaz's PhD is from the University of Hawaii. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be back. Good to be back here. I understand that we need to focus, and primarily the panel is supposed to focus on what can be done. However, before going into this question, the vital question, let me address three issues or three questions. What do we know now? And the elephant in the room, or so to speak, the coverage in international media, whether there has been or is any connection between the local militant groups who are claiming all these, whether there is a connection between IS or AQIS. I will try to address that one. And third point is why it is happening now. So what do we know actually? What we know for sure is the number of attacks have grown over the years, particularly since 2013. Over the last 4 months, if you look very closely, the number has remarkably gone up. If we look back for a year, let's take 14 months, there has been 35 attacks so far that we know, reported in the press, costing 36 lives. And definitely if we go back further, we would see that there are 42 attacks. Despite the fact the government reports, at least the police has acknowledged so far only 24 of them. Of those attacks that we have seen reported in press, 14 of them have been, responsibility for those attacks have been, 14 or 15 has been taken by ISIS. And Al-Qaeda in Indian subcontinent has claimed responsibility for about 8 or 9 of them. But what we have seen is the widening of the targets, so to speak, meaning that previously, if you go back in 2013, what we first encountered is the killing of a blogger called Ahmed Razib Haider. But since then, we have seen not only, quote-unquote, the bloggers or, quote-unquote, the atheists, it has gone beyond that. Now, the LGBT activist, Zulhas Manan, whom I knew personally, and it's a personal loss for me because I knew him very well. And it is truly to say something about him. I'm trying to avoid because I would be very emotional because I've met him several times and I was impressed. Such a bright person, and for nothing that lives has been lost. So has been others, And this spate of killings that we have seen, it is targeted towards minority, it is targeted towards who are being labeled as atheists for whatever reasons, and the LGBT activists, and beyond that. It is not only that, we have seen the others, becoming target. And what we know, for the third point, is this, the government's position has shifted. If we go back to 2013, gone are the days when Prime Minister would rush to the, someone to a slain blogger's home and say, okay, he's the first martyr of this movement, so on and so forth. Now, there has been efforts to somewhat making a distance between what is happening. And recent comments coming out of the governments is not exactly very, very encouraging, And then it is widening to that extent. Today, if you have seen the press, yesterday the local press in Rajshahi, the press club has received a threat against 10 university professors in Rajshahi. And then again, we have seen the situation outside Bangladesh where, some of the people who are in Singapore have been implicated and been sent back to Bangladesh. So it is widening. It is getting worse. We'll have to acknowledge the fact, and we should start from there, that it is absolutely, I agree with you. Compared to Afghanistan, it's not bad. Fortunately, it's not bad. Should we wait until that? Should we wait to Bangladesh to become Syria? Of course not. Nobody would. So that needs to be recognized. The second point is the one, the elephant in the room. Is AQIS is there. If we read the Beak, we would say, okay, IS is there. If we take the claim of the face value, we would say, okay, AQIS is there. But I think this question is a moot point. You know why? Because connections between what is described as homegrown terrorists in Bangladesh and regional, extra-regional elements have been there since the mid-1990s. Let us not forget that Harkat-ul-Jihad al-Islam landed in Bangladesh in the middle of the 1990s, and largely with an agenda to use Bangladesh as a springboard for getting into Myanmar. Let us not forget that there have been a number of incidents, and I'm not talking about last year or 2 years since mid-1990s, that Lashkar-e-Taiba operatives were arrested in Bangladesh. Let us not forget that in 1996, according to own admission, who is being tried in Indian court, Abdurrahman Tunda has operated from Bangladesh. So there has been connections, The transnational connections has been there. Whether that has transformed into connection with IS is moot in the sense that it could be. The person who was previously known to be Huji operative might recently has become IS operative. I don't know. We would not know. And that's why whether it is there or not there kind of debate practically takes the focus away. it is important to understand that what is happening is currently all these splinter groups, smaller ones and unknown groups would come up, and I see that coming up, they are competing for attention. It is, the local, sorry to put it in a very, very not so sophisticated way, people are looking for the McDonald's franchise is being looked by local, chefs kind of situation. Because what is happening is this Jamaat al-Mujahideen Bangladesh, or for that matter Ansar al-Islam, which previously was known as Ansarullah Bangla team, they're competing. Have they succeeded? If opportunity and time permits, they will. If the main factors are not addressed by having a debate whether they are IS or AQIS, that's not going to help. Let's focus on why it is happening. That brings me to my third point, why it is happening. Let me echo what Smena said. The culture of impunity. What we have witnessed since 2013, there has been only one instance. The case has come to conclusion, a verdict. 4 cases are currently on the court system, arrest, under investigation, and very slow investigation. Not only that is happening, what you see is that the culture of impunity is not with respect to, when you are talking about the judiciary, the legal system, you simply, and I think I would say that you can simply focus on one part of it, only whether the militants have been tried or not. Overall law and order situation has deteriorated. And given that the party activists, the ruling party activists, are getting away with things that they are doing, which is detrimental, which is very serious, with a serious implication and ramification, there are others who think that, okay, I can get away too. Maybe they don't have the connection, but that does not prevent them from, taking a risk. So this one part is this culture of impunity. That is within the legal system, within the culture of the rhetoric. If the political parties, irrespective of political parties, whether they're in the ruling party or not, but given the ruling party has more power than any other party, when these kind of things are not addressed, it has a ripple effect. You simply cannot say, okay, I'm going to throw a small pebble in the pond and nothing is going to happen. It's going to happen, bound to happen. And the second part of this is the enabling environment. What is the enabling environment? Judiciary is a part of things, but the overall political situation needs to be taken into account. There is no parallel thing that militancy is this and this is the mainstream politics. They are connected. We need to acknowledge, admit that they are connected. Something happening in the mainstream politics is going to and has been, based on my understanding, has been having effect on this. The violence perpetrated by the BNP and JI, of course, has an impact. But at the same time, heavy-handed measures by the government, targeting the opposition, blaming opposition even before the whole investigation starts. What kind of message does it send? Can we actually separate the enforced disappearance, extrajudicial killings, and think that, okay, those are somewhere out there and these are militancy are out there? No, they're not connected in the sense that you can see it obviously, but enabling environment is an issue that is going to have an impact. And I think that enabling environment is the absence of the freedom of expression. Take, for example, Information and Communication Technology Act, Article 57. Over the years, this has become a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it has become the anti-blasphemy law of Bangladesh. Anyone who speaks about anything related to religion turn out to be hurting religious sentiment. And unfortunately, it looks like that hurting religious sentiment is meaning that hurting religious sentiment of the Muslims. Why not it is about the minority, other religions, Hindus, the Christians, and others. But that has been used for that purpose. On the other hand, criticism of the government, again, let me echo what Smena said, that any legitimate criticism is seen by the government. That, okay, it is as if it's an opposition to them. Not necessarily. Not necessarily that I oppose this government, everything that they do. But citizens should have right to criticize. the valid criticism. In some cases, those criticisms might not be even valid. Okay, fine, listen to them and say, okay, we listen to you. But it doesn't merit any attention. But there are criticism which merits attention. So those kind of enabling environment that we have seen, impacts of those are seen on the ground. When the democratic space shrunk, and when this situation of freedom of expression is curtailed, and this is coming from both sides, whether it's the machete or magistrate, whether it is the militants who are chopping down the people because they spoke something that they didn't like, or it is the government on the other hand because they think that it is, anti-state. And overall the rhetoric, extremist rhetoric has permeated Bangladeshi politics, unfortunately. Intolerance has grown, either in the name of the religion, or in the name of the nationalism, or for something else. Everyone speaks in a language as if the other part of the society doesn't exist. I may not agree with you, and I won't agree with you. It does not mean that you cannot exist, and I don't recognize your existence. That doesn't work. That doesn't help. And if you look at the rhetoric, in a sense, the current government rhetoric, it shows that if there is a war of rhetoric, the extremists have already won that battle. Because succumbing to their rhetoric is not good. It does not help in the long run. It is detrimental. Not only detrimental to the regime, detrimental to the state, detrimental to the government, and detrimental to the institutions. An institution should be there forever. If the state has to continue, the institution has to be there. Now that brings me to the last point, what can be done? What can be done? First of all, we need to start with the premise. No death is acceptable. No death is acceptable. Whether it is done by non-state actors or by state. Whether it is done as an extrajudicial killing or with the machete. Doesn't matter. We'll have to start with that premise, with that principle. And that's why there are two elements to it. One is the legal system, the judiciary system, the counterterrorism. And the counterterrorism efforts have been very successful. If you look from late 2006 or early 2007, depending on who you are asking, until 2013 or maybe 2012. In 2005, we saw 2004 and 5, particularly in 2005, a rise of these militant groups. And there was a counterterrorism strategy that was adopted, and it worked because it tamed down the militants. Militancy doesn't go away. I don't think it is going to go away. The United States experience of last, even after 5 years of death of Osama bin Laden, aren't we haunted by him, unfortunately. So it's not going to go away. It will be there, but how good do you manage it? How much the legal system, law and order, manages it to keep under the control. That is the challenge. And that succeeded. Bangladesh has succeeded, and it was well done. Until what we see is the city strategy has started to falter. Why it has started to falter? So we need to look into that. If you use city as a means to get to your opposition, that's not going to help. And then, so one part is the city part. That needs to be strengthened. And when the United States wants to work with them, I applaud that one. Yes, that's part. But can we separate that one from the enabling environment? Can we say that, okay, we are going to work on the city and we'll turn a blind eye to the rest of the things? We cannot. We shouldn't. My suggestion would be that of course, devil is always in the details. And this is perhaps not the place that I can go into the details, and maybe I don't know the details. But what I definitely know, what I would like to underscore, is that these two connect things needs to be looked into as a comprehensive thing, rather than seeing it as separate one. U.S. cooperation with Bangladesh on the city measures is absolutely necessary. I'm not questioning that one. But will that become counterproductive? That question needs to be asked as well. And with that in mind, strategies, cooperation, and the path forward needs to be sorted out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Riaz. It was excellent background. You raised a couple questions as well, but I'll wait till Lisa finishes before I ask that. Lisa Curtis is next. Lisa is a senior research fellow here at Heritage for South Asia. She started at Heritage in 2006. Before that, she was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee working for the chairman, Senator Lugar. And prior to that, at the White House as an appointed senior advisor to the and as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for State for South Asian Affairs. I messed all of that up, but she
Yeah, I
knows who
wasn't at
she
the White
is.
House.
She was actually the White House
State Department.
appointed senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for South Asian Affairs, and she's worked on the ground in Pakistan and India as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Walter. And I'll just point out, we've only worked together for 10 years, so
Yes.
it's understandable that he doesn't know my background.
And that's not the first time I've introduced you, I suppose, yeah.
But anyway, it's an honor to be here on the panel with Dr. Riaz, Dr. Ahmed, two people who I have a great deal of respect for in their analyses of South Asia. And I don't want to repeat what's already been said. That's always the risk of being the third panelist. But let me just put forward a few points. So the recent murders that we've seen, particularly over the weekend, of the Hindu tailor Nikhil Jorder, as well as Julhaz Menon, that we've heard about so much today, these are just the latest in a string of murders that have been taking place by extremist forces against what I'll call the liberal intelligentsia. Activists, liberal bloggers, publicists, members of the religious minority. So there have been many victims, but the goal seems to be clear. The goal seems to be to silence free speech and to try to Islamicize society. These attacks really began in earnest about 3 years ago, after the Shahbag protests. These were the secular protests which had called for the execution of several Jamaat-e-Islami leaders for alleged war crimes committed during the Bangladeshi independence movement over 45 years ago. So I think there is a connection to the mainstream politics that we heard from Dr. Riaz, but there's also an attempt to Islamicize society, change the complexion of Bangladeshi society. We've always held Bangladesh up as, this model Muslim democracy where you had respect for freedom of the press, women actively involved in the political, economic, social life of the country. So I think all of us here are concerned that that could be changing, and that's why we're here today, to talk about how we can arrest the situation. And I don't think the situation in Bangladesh generally receives enough attention in Washington, D.C. I know Dr. Riaz and I testified before a hearing about a year ago, as well as Jay Kansara, who's here with us in the audience from the Hindu American Foundation. This was last year, a House subcommittee, Asia Pacific subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But other than that, I think that we just don't see enough attention paid to Bangladesh. So hopefully we're helping to change that here with our discussion today. So Dr. Riaz talked about the major question here is whether there are links to global terrorist movements. And I on the one hand, I agree with him that really the point is moot. But at the same time, I think it's worth looking at, because one gets the sense when the government denies any international links that they're downplaying the threat. And I think that would be dangerous, that this is a threat that needs to be taken very seriously. So some of the attacks on the bloggers have been claimed by Ansarullah Bangla team, or Ansarullah Islam, which is Al-Qaeda, associated with Al-Qaeda. They've apparently been inspired by Al-Qaeda writings. Other attacks have been claimed by ISIS, particularly the attack on the Shiite procession last year. as well as attacks on foreigners in Bangladesh. So the claims were made by ISIS. And I think the only way that we're really going to be able to clarify what is exactly happening and who is behind the attacks is if there is cooperation between the Bangladeshi authorities and the U.S. government. I think the knee-jerk reactions of blaming the political opposition for the murders is just not credible. So I think there is a need for transparent and thorough investigations and then prosecutions of the perpetrators. So it is possible that Al-Qaeda or ISIS are linking up with local groups like the Jamaat al-Mujahideen Bangladesh, the JMB. This is the group that was responsible for the string of bombings in August 2005 in Bangladesh. Several of their leaders were executed by the government in 2007. However, the group was not destroyed altogether, and it looks like it could have revived. And there were also reports of some JMB activists being arrested last year for trying to get in touch with ISIS. So we certainly see hints of the international element there. And as Dr. Riaz pointed out, in ISIS's sort of flagship magazine, Dabiq, there was a 5-page article titled "The Revival of Jihad in Bengal." And from Al-Qaeda's point of view, we have definitely seen an increased interest in Bangladesh, going back to January 2014 when there was an audio message released by Ayman al-Zawahiri called Bangladesh Massacre Behind a Wall of Silence. And then in September 2014, of course, we had the launch of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, and there was a video by Zawahiri, and Bangladesh was a major focus of that, the launch of that group. So it is possible that there's an element of competition here. And whether that competition is between local groups, between the ABT and the JMB, who are, each pledging allegiance to different, to either Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or there's actual competition from Al-Qaeda and ISIS, that is still unclear. But there's definitely some element of competition going on here. So what is the way forward? As I mentioned, I think the U.S. has to work closely with the Bangladeshi authorities in investigating these incidents. This will help determine if there is in fact global involvement and therefore be able to stop that. And I think the U.S. has to be more assertive in pushing for dialogue between the government and the political opposition, because I do believe that the political polarization we have seen in Bangladesh over the last 2-3 years has opened the door for the Islamists to conduct attacks of this nature and to start pushing an extremist agenda. I just don't think it would be possible if there was less political polarization, more compromise between the two sides. So I think the U.S. has to get more active and more assertive in really pushing both sides towards some kind of political compromise. Now, the Sheikh Hasina government deserves a lot of credit for cracking down on terrorism and for emphasizing the secular principles of the country's founding, no doubt. But I think right now we need to see a redoubling of that effort against extremism. And unfortunately, we haven't seen very helpful statements from the government. Here I'm talking about a few weeks ago, after the assassination of one of the bloggers. I think it was the Home Minister, which commented to CNN that, well, the bloggers need to be more careful of what they write about, almost blaming the victim rather than the perpetrators. So that is unhelpful. I think what we need to see from the government is a commitment to freedom of speech, promotion of religious freedom, and the right to free trials and due process of law. And here I'm referring to the International Crimes Tribunal. And there have been concerns among the human rights community that these trials have been politicized and that the defendants are not getting a chance to make their case. Now, what I hear often from government supporters or supporters of the Awami League is that, well, there's popular support for these trials and there's popular support for these executions. And I say that's all the more reason you need to have a commitment to fair trials. You can't have, the due process of law driven by the will of the public or by what's popular. So it's important that these trials be carried out in an impartial manner and that they don't feed this political polarization that we were all talking about. And just the last point, that obviously everyone who believes in the democratic process in Bangladesh, whether it be the ruling party, Awami League, or the BNP, or Jamaat-e-Islami, or any of the other political players in Bangladesh, everyone loses if this extremist threat continues to escalate. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lisa. If I could just start by asking Dr. Riaz and Dr. Ahmed. Lisa touched on the ideological component here, that the part of this that may be driven by political ideology. And Dr. Riaz, you talked about the enabling environment, but you didn't touch on that. And I wonder maybe if both of you could address that issue. That is that it seems to me impossible to talk about the enabling environment in particular without talking about the substance of that enabling environment. And if the political environment is becoming more and more influenced by extremist Islamism of some sort, and that's what it is. There's these people are murdering in the name of their religion. We can all say that it has nothing really to do with the religion. I would maintain that myself personally, but it is driving some of this. It would appear, and wherever you are, it seems. That has something to do with the prevalence of the attacks, whether you're in Belgium or you're in Indonesia. If you have these free zones or these areas where people are, I don't mean free zones in a physical sense, but I mean in terms of discussion about their political ideology, something that's ultimately very oppressive. So anyway, I don't want to go on too long, but can you address the ideological part of this, each of you?
When I talk about enabling environment, of course, I'm talking about the domestic enabling environment, and definitely the ideological component is an issue that we need to address. The menacing act in the name of religion by these groups does not justify their action in any way, but we cannot simply discount, okay, just because they don't justify, we are not going to look into it. We will look into it. But how do you enter into that debate? Do you enter into that debate in a theocratic, as a matter of theology and issues, or do you see it as a political one? I, as a political scientist, would prefer to enter into this conversation from the political end of it, which means that how do you create a situation where these things are not appealing to the people? There will always be a small group of people. And as I say, David Koresh, you do remember David Koresh. There are always David Koresh in every society, So there are people who would be attracted to it. But if you make competing ideology available, attractive, then you can counter those things. Otherwise, leaving a vacuum, they're simply attacking this ideology that, okay, this is menacing. Yes, everyone knows. More people have died in their hands. And if you count by the number, more Muslims have died. But that does not tell you the complete story, because how do you confront them? And one country at a time, in the sense, there is a global dimension to it, because then when we take into the global dimension, there are other issues of your foreign policy, how it is perceived, how it is being used. There are a lot of other elements to it. But when you are looking at the specific country by country, you'll have to, I would suggest that we should try to address what are the elements that we can insert into this political domain, so that these kind of twisted logic are not acceptable. This kind of twisted ideology is not appealing to anybody. And that's why city party is one. As I say, counterterrorism is one part of it. But that itself is not going to solve. The ideological part, the political part is very important. And within the political part is the ideological part, an institutional part. Those are the things. That's why I think it is, when I said political part, that is where the ideology rests.
But don't you think that the government's insufficient response has something to do with the prevailing political debates? I mean, you mentioned the difference in the way they reacted this time than when they reacted 2 years ago. Isn't that something to do with the debates around political Islam and those sorts of things?
That's why I'm suggesting for openness. Let's have more openness so that we can have the debate. Don't constrain me to battle this, radical Islamist. And if I use myself as an example, more than a decade, I have been working on radical Islamism, and I've tried to argue that this is not a path. Now, if that space is restricted, when you are restricting the space, you cannot simply say, okay, this is restricted for, okay, Lisa can talk, but Ali cannot talk. The restriction itself, that's why within openness, I am more optimistic. If there is an openness, if we can have a conversation within the Bangladeshi society about the role of religion, we won't agree. It's not going to that 165 million or so Bangladeshis would come to an agreement tomorrow or 3 months down the line. No, there would be a debate. These are the ongoing debate. Aren't we having that debate here too? It's going on after 200 plus years. The race relation in this country, have we resolved that issue? No, we haven't. This kind of environment requires that we have openness to have that conversation. Conversation with respect to the role of religion in the public sphere, the role of religion in society, relationship between the state and religion, what democracy means, how that involves, how democracy would allow, how much space that would be allowed, what do we mean by secularism. That conversation needs to take place. That is the battle. The battle is not only repressive measure. The battle is not only counterterrorism. Battle is not only, that is one part of it. But the ideological battle, by constraining the space, by shrinking that space, that is counterproductive. That is what I'm trying to underscore here.
I see. Dr. Ahmed,
Let me put it to you this way. Quite obviously, the groups that Lisa and Dr. Riaz identified have a very distorted, extremist, radical version of what they see as the ideal and the only acceptable political order based on their notions of religion. That ideological dimension separates them perhaps from mainstream Islamic parties that also believe that Sharia should be the basis of the state's political order, but where violence is not the means to attain it. What we see with the groups within Bangladesh, and as I said earlier on, and I completely agree with you, where Bangladesh is right now is in the earliest stages of what we saw in other South Asian countries before the rot became so widespread, is how do you attain that goal, your ideological goal? Now, this is the way the attacks have taken place. It's very targeted violence. Look, it's one thing to use a gun. How much fear does it inspire? It's another thing to hack somebody to death in their house. And how many voices do you silence? And why are those voices being silenced? Because quite obviously those voices were more of a threat to what is a challenge for these extremist groups, the liberal secular voices. And Bangladesh is actually interesting in itself, where it started off very much in its formation and the struggle for independence for a secular state, but that is very unusual in a Muslim majority country. But there was creeping Islamization way before these groups were created because of internal political conflict and tensions. A military regime that introduced the notion of Bangladeshi as opposed to Bengali, religion and its place in the state, the recent Supreme Court decision on is Bangladesh an Islamic state or not? Is it a secular state? So in some ways Bangladesh, even in its structure and its polity, has moved away from where it was to where it is now. But let me emphasize that the problem lies in the fact that these groups have been allowed in some ways to flourish in this political void. It's not just the culture of violence, because after all, the vast majority of the Bangladeshi population is not in support of either this extremist ideology or the use of violence for political ends. This is still a fringe minority, and I think we need to remember that. These are still very small groups. They're not that organized. But they're very targeted in their strategy to depict a footprint which is much larger than it actually is. And I think there's where the opportunities lie, provided that this rot is stemmed now and not allowed to flourish. And that can only be if the climate of impunity is addressed. If we've seen in other examples where there is appeasement, these groups flourish and manage to depict themselves as the desirable option. Where the state uses the rule of law and relies on the rule of law, that is the best and most effective way to counter criminality, because what we are talking about here is not ideology, we're talking about criminality.
If I may just add two quick points. One is this targeted violence. All this violence, we need to consider those as violence as a theater. It is not only targeting individuals, it is sending a message, a very chilling message to the society. And this theatrics of it, the brutality of it, hacking and the way it is perpetrated, the modus operandi of those are clearly a message. That needs to be understood. The second thing is this Islamization. The creeping Islamization is the result of the politics of expediency. And that is why whenever there are politics of expediency that turn out to be very bad, long-term consequence of expedient politics is where Bangladesh, that has brought Bangladesh into this kind of situation.
Thank you. Let me open it up to questions in the very back. Jay.
Hi. Thank you for convening this very important panel. And it was a privilege to speak on the same panel as Ali and Lisa last year. Jay Kansar with the Hindu American Foundation. I visited Bangladesh last year, and the primary line that I got from most Hindus, all Hindu leaders that I met with, and as well as Christian and Buddhist, was that because Bangladesh had deviated from its original intent to remain a secular society and Islamization had crept into the constitution and therefore gave a free hand to Islamists in society, we have therefore become second-class citizens. And so my question is that why would the U.S. not want to support the Supreme decisions like the Supreme Court or efforts by the Supreme Court to re-secularize Bangladesh, which was the original intent, and how can the United States say that it is for democracy if it is, in fact, enabling this environment to ensue? I understand the political reality is one thing, but the Islamists were declaring that they would riot in the streets directly, Jamaat Islami included, that they would riot in the streets if the Supreme Court decided that Bangladesh was not to be a Muslim state anymore. So this is also not helping the situation when the United States fails to address this.
Thank you. Could you, I guess, Lisa, you mentioned that a little bit in your remarks. That is the response of the U.S. government should be more forceful. But Is that
Yeah.
what you had in mind?
Well, I don't know that the U.S. government has been opposed to the resecularizing of the Constitution, the Bangladeshi Constitution.
It's not a part of, it's not a
Well,
foremost
look.
part of our
Yeah.
objectives in Bangladesh.
Okay, the U.S. Must support democracy in Bangladesh, and with that comes, many different aspects. Democracy is about free speech. Democracy is about freedom of religion. Democracy is about political participation, right to assemble. Democracy is about rule of law. It's about right to a free trial. So, we're talking about many different aspects of the democratic process. And I don't think the U.S. really has a role to play in taking sides in, the internal politics of Bangladesh. So I think, there's a fine line here. The U.S. needs to stand up for democracy in all its forms. But in terms, I'm not sure what you would expect from the U.S. Like I said, I don't think there's been any opposition to the resecularizing of the Bangladeshi Constitution. If you're asking for, I don't know what you're asking for, but I'm not sure that I really understand, what more the U.S. can do besides support democracy in Bangladesh, support people's, right to vote, right to participate in their political system, right to debate, right to have free trials. These are the things that the U.S. needs to stand up for. And if you have a particular policy option that you're considering, by all means, would like to hear that.
Thank you. Yeah, right here.
Thank you. From your discussion, it is clear to us that crisis in democracy and democratic governance is the main problem in Bangladesh. I want to ask the discusser that in USA, federal and state government has bicameral parliament. Do you think the crisis of democracy in Bangladesh can be removed by bicameral parliament in Bangladesh?
Do you want to address that, Dr. Riaz? This is the actual form of the government. What would the impact be?
Let me think for a couple of seconds. Will that solve the problem? Let me be very blunt, unfortunately. No. Because that is not the issue. The governance issue is not how it is structured. Would that help? Of course, that might help. I don't know. But that is, to me, the issue of governance is not how it is structured, how it is more essence. Essence is the point here. And essentially, what you described as a crisis of governance, and to borrow your phrase, crisis of governance, is because of the rule of law, absence of rule of law, because of the institutions not working. And let me refer back to ICG's report. The criminal justice system is not exactly working well. So without addressing those things, just having two bicameral, what solution that might bring? Having said that, will that, as a counterfactual argument, you say, okay, that might. But I don't see that as a solution to the current problem.
Yeah, right here. We'll get a microphone for you. Maybe identify yourself.
My name is Asan, and I'm from Voice of America. My question is to actually all three of you, the panel members, is that since '91, we have seen until 2006, if I'm not wrong, that BNP and Awami League, these two main political parties, were alternating in coming to power. And after that, the caretaker government took power for 2 years or something like that. And since then, for the first time, after many years, Awami League has come to power twice in a row. And for the first time, we have seen the execution of war criminals or alleged war criminals. in the last few years. And I think things got out of control since the hanging or the execution of the war criminals in 2012, since 2012.
13.
And there was a huge campaign by mainly the opposition parties, Islamist Party, Jamaat and BNP, on ordinary people since 2013. More than 150 ordinary people were burned to death in broad daylight throughout Bangladesh. And all these things are happening for the first time. The execution of alleged war criminals, Awami League coming into power for 2 terms in a row, and this kind of violence. Is it possible that there is a connection? Because there, of course, now things are out of control, apparently. But these are the things that have happened in Bangladesh for the first time. Trial, whether it's free or not, it's debatable, but the anger of the opposition party, for example, in the last election, which I think may not be recognized by some governments as free, and but as far as we know, the ruling party and the government tried to bring the opposition party, main opposition party, into a dialogue, but the opposition party boycotted. And the opposition party made an alliance with the Islamist party, and they are not vocal about condemning these war criminals. And is there any connection, do you think, between all these things?
Right, that's a good question. Dr. Ahmad, do you want to take a first try at that?
Well, 2014, it was a contested election. Contested elections raise all kinds of tensions. And yes, I think the opposition, in particular its partner, the Jamaat-e-Islami, and its student wing, was responsible for some egregious acts of violence. I'll leave aside the ICT for a minute because I really think you're talking about the conflict between the 2 political parties. The ICT trials matter when BNP leaders and activists are also charged. Leave aside the Jamaat-e-Islami angle at the moment. The problem lies in the fact that it was violence that then met with violence, but on the part of a government that has the security apparatus under its control. And this is where I think we stand today, which is while the BNP, at least in the last 1 year, has not resorted to violence, you still have the government using repressive means. Arrest, detentions, Dr. Riaz spoke about extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, political prisoners in a country which did not have a tradition of large-scale arrests of opposition activists during a democratic interlude. Earlier, yes, we saw incredible violence when there was bloody regime change. But this time around, as you say, this is a democratic interlude. So when the Awami League has responded to violence, with violence to violence, that I think muddies the political waters even further, and as I think all of us have said, creates a space for violent extremists to then depict the institutions of the state as illegitimate and their ability then to deliver justice. So have the war crimes, because they were executions of war criminals, been the primary driving factor? I think the primary driving factor was the 2 mainstream parties, the largest parties in Bangladesh that have formed government or opposition for most of its democratic history, resorting to unlawful means, one a government and the other the opposition.
Thank you. Before I get one more question, we've got a question from the internet I wanted to read and maybe get some reaction, especially from Lisa, but everyone is welcome to respond to it. It's a very specific question. It's from Utsav Chakrabarti of the World Hindu Council of America. Question is, it is well known that many members of ISIS globally have been members of the Tablighi Jamaat, which is hugely popular in Bangladesh. Also, one of the biggest socio-political groups in Bangladesh, the Jamaat-e-Islamiyya, shares many radical ideas and causes with global terrorist groups. Do you think that declaring these two Jamaat groups as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, will help protect minorities and will help the government of Bangladesh contain radical groups?
Yeah, this is interesting because this actually came up at a conference that I participated in the morning, which was on extremism and terrorism, sort of global. And so this issue came up in relation to the Muslim Brotherhood, as a matter of fact, and whether declaring the Muslim Brotherhood an FTO made sense. Now, I would argue that no, this does not make sense. That, the point is to encourage politics, to encourage peaceful political participation. And I think you could make the argument that had you had a free and fair election in 2014, did you have the participation of the opposition, the Jamaat-e-Islami, in Parliament right now, that you probably wouldn't have this space for extremists to be exploiting. So I think there is a relationship. So, when the law is broken, obviously people need to be punished. Now, are some of these ideologies that these groups press, or is their agenda, is it helpful? No, oftentimes not. Sometimes the agenda of these Islamist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Jamaat-e-Islami, their policies repress women, they repress religious minorities, they call for the imposition of Sharia, full Islamic law, and these things are not helpful for democracy. And in fact, these can ultimately lead to terrorism. So I think this is a difficult question that I think everybody grapples with, because on the one hand, you're trying to encourage political participation and for people to express themselves through the politics, not through violence. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that some of these ideologies, in fact, are dangerous to democratic development. But I believe that if you have an alternate ideology, which is more appealing, that this is the best way to fight the ideologies, not necessarily by making the parties themselves illegal, because then, in fact, you could make the ideologies more appealing. Or you can drive the people underground and drive them more toward a violent agenda.
Okay. Okay. Let me take two more questions and then we'll wrap up. In the very back and then here on the corner.
Hi,
So,
Seth Olmixon with Liberty South Asia. Talking about elephants in the room, there was one that I think got overlooked a little bit, and I was wondering if you could talk about, and that's the role of Pakistan, and in particular Pakistan's ISI, in facilitating Islamic extremism in Bangladesh. Dr. Riaz, you spoke a bit about Lashkar-e-Taiba operating in Bangladesh. In fact, Hafiz Saeed has been doing tours of Bangladesh, especially recruiting Rohingyas. Bangladesh has PNG'd multiple diplomats over the course of the past year for evidence in funding Islamist militant groups. And there's also been credible evidence, including statements by former ISI officers in Pakistani courts that they were providing funding to BNP and Jamaat-e-Islami in order to replace the Awami League government, who they saw as too close to India.
Great, thank you. And then let me take this question right here, and then we can have maybe if you can answer the questions and any wrap-up comments you'd like to make.
Hi there, my name is Danish. I'm a freelance writer. My question is kind of digresses a bit on the counterinsurgency and more hard policy questions. You've seen that in Pakistan, there's been a counter narrative to, go against the jihadi culture that is specifically pervaded in Punjab in Pakistan through, Sufi, the Sufi culture, and especially in India, there's been, initiatives by Prime Minister Modi to go to the World Sufi Forum. In Pakistan, you've got the Coke Studio and like certain artists taking up the mantle, and whether that trickles down and actually has effects in, subduing the effects of Jamaat-e-Islami insurgents, that's debatable. In Bangladesh, of course, it's a land of pluralistic thinkers like Tagore or Jibananda Das and whatnot. And there has been some limited Sufi presence in Bangladesh. To what extent do you think that underlying reviving a certain amount of secular heritage within Bengali arts, whether it's Tagore from West Bengal or even the Sufi culture, do you think that could definitely help the situation in Bangladesh? Thank you.
That's a good question. Yeah. Who wants to start? Why don't you start, Lisa, and then we can work back this way.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea, and hopefully our USAID programs are working in this direction. I think promoting culture and the arts is one way to counter what the extremists are doing, because obviously they're attacking people who are working toward the culture. I'm thinking about this professor who was killed recently, I think just within the last 2 weeks, who was somebody who was trying to promote the arts in Bangladesh. And his daughter felt the need, I think, to come out and say, look, he was not an atheist. He was very, religious man. But I think that these are positive programs that the U.S. can support in these countries. I know many years ago we had a program where we were, working with the imams in Bangladesh and taking them to USAID projects and talking about the projects. I mean, this is years ago, going back, 10, 15 years ago. But, these are the kinds of programs that I think, the U.S. should be engaged in and working toward. And I would just say I would be very surprised if Hafiz Muhammad Saeed was allowed into Bangladesh. I would be very doubtful of that. So I think, I would just, I'm not sure where that information is coming from, but I would be highly doubtful if LET leader, founder Hafiz Muhammad Saeed was allowed to travel to Bangladesh.
I'll follow up with some information for you.
Okay.
Thank you. Chris?
I tend to, maybe my political science training, tend to see everything upside down. Why do you call there should be a counter-narrative to this Islamist narrative? This is the counter-narrative. Islamist narrative is the counter-narrative. The mainstream is the secularist narrative. So and I use quotation within the secularist. Bangladesh don't have to borrow Rabindranath from West Bengal. Its national anthem is written by Rabindranath. So Bangladesh is Rabindranath Tagore. So, and Lisa, I tend to disagree with you. United States should not be mixing with this kind of thing. This is indigenous culture. Let them flourish. Any external intervention and trying to promote would only have backlash. They would be seen patronized, and that is not helpful, That's why what you are suggesting, and when you refer to Mr. Modi, I have a little bit of skepticism about Mr. Modi himself. So let me go on record in saying that I would not take any lesson from Mr. Modi. I would rather take it from someone else. But that's me. You are welcome to take lesson from Mr. Modi. Having said that, the central point is that exploring the indigenous traditions of tolerance. I take that as a message from you. Despite that differences, I understand where you're trying to go. It is there, and I agree with what Samina told. There's still fringe. Let us understand, still fringe. It hasn't become Pakistan yet, fortunately, with due respect to my Pakistani friends. that needs to be cultivated, but culture itself can be cultivated when there are this environment of inclusiveness. A mainstream society, if LGBTs are excluded, then that gives someone a rationale to go after the LGBTs. If the Hindu community, as we speak, it is not only the Islamist. The land grabbing of Hindus are going on an everyday basis. If you read newspapers, unless we stop that one, lip service to Hindu community is not going to work. That is lip service at best. Because the persecution of Hindu communities in Bangladesh over the last 8 years has gone worse. I'm not justifying, I'm not exonerating anybody who had done those things previously. Bangladeshi state has failed miserably in last 45 years to protect its minorities, period. Whether they're BNP, Awami League, whoever was in Ershad, Ziaur Rahman, doesn't matter. So that's what we need to look into, exploring the tolerance, inclusiveness, irrespective of political, religious ideologies, as well as, sexual orientation and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Dr. Ahmed, you get the last word.
Very briefly, I think we need to understand both in the context, actually, not just in the context of Bangladesh, but Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. The religion of choice of the citizens of the largest Muslim majority countries is moderate Islam. In all three countries, you've seen fringe extremist elements challenging what to them is the biggest threat, which is this moderate Islam. How they've gone about it and how successful states have been, unfortunately in the Pakistani and Afghanistan case, the threat has been much larger because the threat hasn't been addressed when it should have been. And where we are in Bangladesh today is, it's not the tipping point as yet. But unless this threat is taken seriously, this fringe minority will become more of a threat to the state and the citizen. On the question of violent extremists with regional and transnational links, I do think you need to separate the BNP from the Jamaat-e-Islami. There has been a coalition between these two parties, but they are not necessarily one whole entity. They are still two very separate parties. And the Jamaat-e-Islami, again, the interesting thing about the Jamaat-e-Islami is that it has, after all, a presence in three countries, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And it does have a very distinct ideology of its own. And unfortunately, in at least two of these countries that I know of, Pakistan and Bangladesh, it has contributed to more orthodox and more intolerant versions of Islam and used violence as a political tool.
Great. Well, this has been an extraordinarily helpful conversation today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. And I like Lisa, think we ought to be talking more about Bangladesh and maybe not just at crisis points, where we'll find some other good times to talk about it. So please join me in thanking our guests. Thank you all for coming.